Kolamet. I'm Rabbi Anna Boswell-Levy, and I'm so honored that we are all here today. I'm so honored to welcome Dr. Lori Lefkovitz here to speak with us. This year, the Kolamet is pleased to be the site of the Reconstructionist movement offering of toward the Global Day of Jewish Learning. And we're in our third year where the Jewish Reconstructionist communities are live streaming a presentation for the Global Day event. So I just want to say that in 1 year, almost exactly, Philadelphia is going to be hosting the Reconstructionist Movement Convention. And that is going to be held at the Doubletree Hotel in Center City, Philadelphia, from November 15th through 18th. 2018, so please come out. I'm sure that Kolamet will be a robust participant in the event. Mark your calendars. So back to today. We are so honored that Lori could be with us this morning. Lori Hope Lefkovitz holds the Rudderman Chair in Jewish Studies at Northeastern University, where she directs the Humanities Center and Jewish Studies program and is a professor of English. Her book, In Scripture, The First Jewish Stories of Jewish Sexual Identities, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in the Women's Studies category. She's a graduate of Brandeis University, and she received her PhD in English from Brown University and was a recipient of the Woodrow Wilson Dissertation Fellowship in Women's Studies, a Golda Meir postdoctoral fellowship at Hebrew University, and she had a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of the Philadelphia Association for Psychoanalysts, and she was a senior Fulbright professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and she also had an honorary doctorate from RRC, my alma mater, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. She is widely published in the fields of literature, critical theory, and Jewish women's studies. She was the Gottesman Professor of Gender and Judaism and the founding director of Kolot, the Center for Jewish Women's and Gender Studies at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Under her direction, Kolot developed Rosh Chodesh, It's a Girl Thing, and the innovative website ritualwell.org. And I should say that Lori was one of my absolute most favorite professors in rabbinical school, and I was so happy to collaborate with her when I was co-chair of the student committee of Kolot at RRC. And I am so delighted to reunite with you and to welcome you to Kolamet.
So thank you for being the audience for this occasion of global Jewish learning. And I have to say, first of all, thank you, Kolamet, for hosting this occasion. Thank you to the Reconstructionist movement for continuing to embrace me as one of your own and including me on this day. It's really a very great privilege. And most of all, thank you to Rabbi Anna, who was an exemplary student and wonderful in all regards, and my partner in developing, I think, a very important enterprise in Jewish women's and gender studies when we worked together at Kolot. So lots of gratitude, and it's actually very exciting to participate in a venture like this, a day that is designed to unify the Jewish community through the enterprise that we all share, which is text study and learning and the riches of Judaism. As it happens, this theme of beauty and ugliness, which is the theme for this year's occasion, is absolutely fortuitous for me. It's held my interest for a long time. As Rabbi Anna mentioned, my very first book, which was published now, I hesitate to say 30 years ago, was called The Character of Beauty in the Victorian Novel. And that subject of beauty is dear to me because it sits on the threshold. Beauty sits on the threshold of inside and outside, of body and soul, subjectivity and objectivity. And it raises all kinds of questions of cultural relativism. That is, what's beautiful in one time and place is not necessarily beautiful in another time and place. So it raises these questions of relativism, of aesthetic value, what different people value and why, ambivalence, ambiguity, and tradition and change. And for me, that is really a core of Judaism itself. More recently, that is within the last decade, I published a book on the Hebrew Bible, as Rabbi Amos said, in scripture, the first stories of Jewish sexual identities. And what I would say most of my work shares is that I try to show, and what I want to explore with you today, through the case of one beautiful man, the character of Joseph in the Hebrew Bible, who is described as beautiful, I'd like to show the power of stories, and more particularly, how stories reveal what we think of ourselves and what we think of others. And what we think of ourselves and what we think of others has a lot to do with how we end up being treated and how we treat other people. Stories are told, especially Bible stories, are told and retold with variations over time. They're told as midrash again, they're retold in later variations over the course of history, and Bible stories are the subject, as you will see in this, my very first PowerPoint, in the traditions of art. So I want to look at that, because the way stories are told and retold over time create kinds of ruts in the cultural psyche that affect the status of truth. When we say something, we're not up to that yet. When we tell a story over and over again, whether or not it is true, it starts to feel true. So over time, people have disagreed about what is beauty and what's ugly, what is beautiful, what is ugly, with the boundary between the two, and they are on the threshold of one another. But often we do agree about what's beautiful, but the criteria are vague. When it comes, for example, to the qualities of a beautiful face, some philosophers of aesthetics have said that the whole key is symmetry. It's all about symmetry. But other philosophers of aesthetics have said, actually, what makes something beautiful is subtle asymmetry. So everything in its opposite. And the secret to real beauty, we just don't know. What we do know is that at any given moment, when it comes to human beauty, to human size, human shape, the human face, at any moment there are competing styles of beauty. So you can have varieties of blonde beauty and varieties of dark beauty and varieties of red beauty, dark and fair, blue-eyed, black-eyed, rosy, olive, delicate, strong, all can be beautiful. But what we don't often think about is the extent to which these differences in physical description carry meaning. And where I will come in 1 minute is to the question of Jewish beauty, and if there is such a thing. But I want to linger for another minute or so on theory, on the theory of beauty. So the first thing to say is that adjectives penetrate the surface of our bodies. So a dangerously jealous, seductive heroine might be described early on, before we get to know her, as having green eyes. Because what's important there, let me ask that as a question, actually. I'll repeat what you say. Why would a jealous heroine have green eyes? Why is green the color of jealousy? That's strange. Because there's this thing called the green-eyed monster. And the green-eyed monster is a figure for jealousy. So it will import that idea into your unconscious. Another thing that can happen is a hero can be described early on in the fiction as having a broad forehead. And later, what you will discover about him in the course of the story is that his main quality is that he's broad-minded. And it's already been implanted in you. This heroine can have clear eyes, and we'll discover that she has a kind of clarity of vision. And you've been manipulated by the description without knowing it. So description enters the unconscious as a strategy of characterization. And what's more complicated, and this is sort of the first item on your source sheet, is a little paragraph from the theorist Roland Barthes, who makes the point here, and I won't read the whole thing out loud, is that beauty can't really be explained, right? It doesn't, it simply asserts itself. It can be described, but mostly it's asserted. He or she was beautiful. So beauty, Barthes makes the point, is often asserted as a citation. As beautiful as the Madonna, as beautiful as Venus. And once the association is made, well, as beautiful as the Madonna as beautiful as what? As beautiful as Venus? Venus as beautiful as what? It's an infinite regress. It doesn't really tell you anything, except that once you have a comparison like that, what's imported is the character to whom the beautiful character has been compared. So someone as beautiful as the Madonna, what's imported is a kind of virtue or piety or purity. Venus, by contrast, is the power of the goddess, right? Quite different from the power of the Madonna. And now we can go to the next slide, because I'm going to have one example for you. And this is the story of the Ivory Girl. And I want to just show you a little of her history. So once upon a time, the Roman writer Ovid, whose Metamorphoses was published in the year 8 AD, so a couple of thousand years ago. Those of you who remember the Metamorphoses, it's the story of stories of transformation. You know, how Niobe became the weeping willow, for example. In that story, there is a sculptor named Pygmalion. And Pygmalion thinks that all women are immoral. They lack virtue. He can't find a beloved because women are so immoral. So he's a sculptor. He takes ivory and he sculpts his ideal woman, an ivory girl. And he gives her a name, Galatea. This is a really problematic story. Galatea. So he sculpts Galatea and she's beautiful, and he pets this ivory statue and he has fallen in love with it. And at some point, the goddess Venus feels pity on him. And one day he is touching his ivory statue, Galatea, and suddenly he feels her warm to life. And she becomes, as we would say in Pinocchio, she becomes a real girl. So Galatea comes to life as a real girl. And of course, what distinguishes her is that she had been a statue. So lacking the powers of subjectivity, you know, she's virtuous. We have to presume, actually, who knows what happens when she became a real girl. But she is the ivory statue who comes to life because of Venus and the love of her creator, Pygmalion. Now, Pygmalion may be a familiar title to you. Pygmalion is the title of a play by George Bernard Shaw, in which a character named Henry Higgins decides that, or announces, he's a linguist, that he can turn the poorest flower girl into a duchess. And of course, so he's a kind of Pygmalion figure, and through the power of language, Shaw is a kind of socialist. He wants to show that really we all have the same stuff. It's about education, language that makes us. And for many of you, the more familiar version of the story of Pygmalion and Henry Higgins will be that of My Fair Lady. And here we have, Audrey Hepburn, who played My Fair Lady in the movie. In the small picture, she is, the flower girl, no mean flower girl there, who is transformed through the power of language into the Duchess. And so you have that transformation. But the final payoff is the Ivory Girl then became, some of you, as old as I am, will remember her. I asked my students about this, they don't remember her. The Ivory Girl was actually immortalized in my youth as a kind of woman who used ivory soap. Because ivory soap was so pure, it floats, right? So the ivory girl was encoded as a certain kind of beautiful girl. What kind of beautiful girl? Yeah, the blonde ponytail girl. She was the girl next door. She was that kind of beautiful. She wasn't exotic. She wasn't the one in stiletto heels. She wasn't draped in jewelry. We had that kind of beauty. She was the ivory girl, and we see her there in the blonde for the soap commercial, and Ivory Snow of the powdered soap, which was really for babies. It was that pure. The skin was white as snow, and all of that imports the history of Pygmalion and Galatea to give us a particular kind of beauty that meant goodness and purity. And I would say that, everything has history, even our own bodies. So when you smell ivory soap, you smell purity. By contrast with zest, where it smells masculine. And I just want to suggest to you that there is nothing natural about the masculinity of zest soap or the purity of the smell of ivory soap, except that advertising works. And it carries the power of all this encoding that isn't natural, but that we have come to take for granted. And that's true about size and shape and everything else. Okay, so it's the purity of the soap or the purity of the statue transfers to these other stories, and by way of cultural meandering, transfers to the smell of soap. Which brings me to a question. Is there such a thing as Jewish beauty? For those of you who can't see the audience because I'm being streamed this way, some wonderful person just pointed to his spouse or partner or next door person. Yes, I agree. Is there such a thing as Jewish? So is there such a thing as Jewish beauty? Just nod yes or no. What do you think? Jewish beauty. Some people are saying yes, some people are like, really, what? So, of course the obvious answer is no. That is, in my own family, we come in every color and every size and every shape. We have blondes, we have some ebony people, we have people who have married Sephardic. My sister remarkably is quite tiny, and then there's me, and every variety of Jew is out there. Jews by choice. So the answer is no. There's no such thing as Jewish beauty, and the answer, of course, is yes. Right? We all know what Jewish beauty is. It's not the ivory girl, right? By contrast, it's the more exotic beauty. It tends to be darker. And now we can go to the next slide, I think. There is a cultural default that comes from the history of art. And what you have here is there's David, the little guy, made famous by Michelangelo, and varieties of characters from the Hebrew Bible who have been represented in art. Particularly, you get your Esthers, your Delilahs, your Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and not so much Leah because she isn't described as beautiful. Mostly Rebecca, often Rebecca at the well. The actual photograph is, I just pulled it from the internet, but it's, some actress playing Rebecca in a movie that tells the Bible story. Very often, these Bible stories, think of, Samson and Delilah, Judith, Esther, are opportunities for painters in the Renaissance to paint a kind of female sexuality that is associated with a particular kind of power, right? Because in the stories themselves, Esther, Judith, Yael, these are heroines who prove what I like to say about all Jewish stories, and that is that the bedroom is the battlefield where men always lose. So no matter how strong the hero, a heroine with a little perfume can, undo someone as powerful as Samson. So that becomes a kind of figure for Jewish beauty. And I would say that so here you have Renaissance art, you have, something in more contemporary film, but through the march of time, in literature, I would say one paradigmatic figure that she becomes is the figure of Rebecca in Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. And now we can move to the next slide, where you will see that Rebecca played in the early movie version by our own Elizabeth Taylor, exactly, looking very Jewish. Right? This was a kind of emblematic Jewish beauty. In the story, Rebecca also she's a real heroine. She's in love with the hero, who of course doesn't marry her. He marries the virtuous Christian Rowena, but she is full of selfless love. And if we go one more slide over, we see how Rebecca is portrayed in the films as and in the story, the novel itself, which was a novel of the Romantic period, very early in the 19th century. She is a kind of doctor, magician, sorceress, lawyer. She speaks many languages, and that becomes a kind of figure for Jewish beauty. Now, here's a question I like to ask audiences. I need you to take 1 second and think for a minute of the connotations of masculinity. And I don't want you to be broad-minded about this. I want you to go to the place of stereotypes. When you stereotype the idea of masculinity, just bring it to mind. Masculinity in its idealized version. Okay, you got it? Masculinity. Now, pause, same exercise, femininity. Femininity, exaggerated stereotype, feminine. Think femininity. You with me? Okay. Now, take those nouns and qualify them with the following adjective. Jewish. Jewish masculinity. Jewish femininity. I don't know what happened in your minds, but I don't know if I'm allowed to do interaction here for this. Yes, I'm being nodded. Yes. Anyone want to say what happened when you did Jewish masculinity, Jewish femininity? Yes.
So when I think of basic masculinity and beauty in today's culture, I think of people half-dressed, I'll say. So, there's a lot of skin showing and, maybe muscles or, there's a lot of skin showing. But in Judaism, we tend to cover our bodies. It's not seen to show a lot of skin. So you've got this opposite, because the two don't necessarily work well in my mind.
Okay.
But when I think of Jewish beauty, I think of a face that's like eyes sparkle, a face that goes intelligent, and like the ruach, the spirit showing through. So the two are very different in my way.
All right. I guess I'm wondering if something. Yes. Sure. I'll take one more.
For masculinity, I thought the word strong. And probably shirtless, but strong.
Strong. Masculinity, strong.
And then when you said femininity, I kind of went with classic as femininity as sort of mincing, kind of
mincing, small, frail, frilly.
Yeah. But when you said Jewish, it worked. I had Jewish strong for the man worked, but it did not work for the woman. But I put Jewish in front of that image because my experience in Jewish women is pretty strong too.
Okay, so it's interesting. I have found over time that that this audience reactions have changed. It used to be that when I said, okay, say Jewish masculinity, Jewish femininity, there would actually be laughter in the room. That somehow the Jewish compromised the fullness of the masculinity and the fullness of the femininity. For some people, it even reversed it. And I think that's less and less true, partly because it is real that when we think of Jewish men and we think Maccabees and we can think of the Israeli soldier, and there was an actual deliberate effort over time to modify Jewish masculinity and recover the masculinity of Jewish men. Jewish men, once upon a time, was kind of an oxymoron. And our heroes were, they're the small guy. They're the younger brother. Think Isaac versus Ishmael. Think Jacob versus Esau. Esau's the hunter. Jacob is the mama's boy who's in the tent. David versus Goliath. He's the little guy who wins over the giant. The smart little guy who sort of culminates in Woody Allen. Gets all the girls anyway, even though you wonder, like, how'd that happen? And the women are strong. Judith, Yael, Rebecca, and in the books, the next slide, please. So I showed you my book, and Umberto Eco's books on beauty and ugliness, which demonstrate the extent to which they function on the threshold of each other. But there's a new book called The Evolution of Beauty by Richard Prong, which I recommend very highly. And he makes the argument that evolving ideals of male beauty have played perhaps the single most important role in evolution. It's because it's about how women choose their mates. And he argues that beauty often forms, I think I'm quoting from the review from the New York Times of this book, it forms the foundation of an entire complex of evolutionary dynamic that affects how we treat each other. And he actually argues that in all of nature, male beauty is getting gentler because more females of various species are choosing gentler beauty. But there's complexities. It's a big book, but I recommend it. So I'm getting to sort of the meat of the matter with the figure of Joseph right now. And I want to perform with you a kind of textual twin experiment. So what's a twin experiment? A twin experiment is, I'm so used to teaching Socratically, I want the room to respond. It's a little counter to the to being live streamed. But a twin experiment is when you take identical twins, or when you have the opportunity, no one ever does this deliberately, but sometimes you have identical twins who are raised in separate environments. And twin experiments are ideal because they help us locate the difference between nature and culture. Because here you have something genetically the same, raised up in two different cultural environments, and you can discover if there are ways to map the differences, because we're always arguing about what's natural, what's cultural. Are we naturally good? Are we naturally aggressive? Are we naturally whatever? So the character of Joseph in the Hebrew Bible, we will soon be reading about, is a shared character in Judaism and Islam. In the Hebrew Bible, the story of Joseph is particularly long and complicated. He is in, chapters 37 to 50, I think, of the book of Genesis. He closes out the book of Genesis, and he occupies a long surah of the Quran, Surah 12. So you have two characters, Yosef, we could say for the Jewish Joseph, and Yusuf in the Quran, the Arabic name for Joseph, who have pretty much the same story, and both are developed in the subsequent midrashic and narrative traditions of each of these, in the Islamic tradition and the Jewish tradition. So I want to look with you at what happens to each of these beautiful men and ask us what that tells us about ourselves. So it's not an unfamiliar story to most of you here, I'm sure, that Joseph is a character who begins, he's the younger until his youngest brother is born in his absence, but he's the youngest of Jacob's children at the point at which he's born. There are other brothers, the brothers of the co-wife Leah, but he's the first and at the time only son of Rachel, He is most loved by his father, which makes his brothers jealous, right? So he has jealous brothers. He's most loved, and the way in which his father shows this extra love, or one actual physical manifestation of that love, is that the father gives him a fancy striped coat, which Joseph prances around in, right? So he has this beautiful coat, and he shows it off. And not only that, he is a big dreamer. And he has dreams of grandiosity. He dreams a dream where, the stars, there are 10 stars, and the sun and the moon, his parents, presumably his brethren, all come and bow down before him. He has other dreams of grandeur, where everybody submits to him. And of course, dreams in the Bible tell a kind of truth. But how do his brothers and father even feel about these dreams? Yeah, they're angry. They hate him even more. And even his father, who loves him very much, says, this is not such a good idea to tell these dreams. Anyway, the brothers' anger and distress ultimately results in their determination to kill him. And instead, they throw him into a pit. And ultimately, they sell him into slavery. And we can move slides because these are famous stories that find their way into the tradition of art. The brothers take Joseph's coat, they tear it, and they bloody it, and they bring it to their father to prove that he's dead. And you can move one slide over here. We have a familiar and beautiful image of Jacob tearing his own clothing in mourning when his sons present him with the evidence that their brother Joseph has been killed by a wild animal because of his bloody coat. And then in a climactic moment in the story, so Joseph is sold, he becomes the servant of the valiant Potiphar in Egypt, and Potiphar's wife, you may remember, tries to seduce him. Joseph is so pious and so chaste and so good. Presumably, the text doesn't say any of this. The text simply says that Joseph declines to be seduced, and in running away, he drops his coat, and a second coat enters his wardrobe, and then Potiphar's wife takes her vengeance by saying, "Your servant tried to rape me," and uses the coat as evidence of his aggression. Potiphar throws him into jail. There he would have sat forever, presumably, except that the Pharaoh at some point, the ruler of all Egypt, starts to have bad dreams. And none of his millions of advisors know what to make of them. And then somebody who had been in prison with the baker, the butcher, the winemaker, remembers that there was this guy in prison who's a dream interpreter. Joseph is called to the Pharaoh. Joseph interprets the dreams perfectly and becomes an indispensable advisor to the Pharaoh. He advises Pharaoh that there will be full years followed by lean years. He advises a kind of patience and frugality, which is not unlike his own character of having resisted the temptation of Potiphar's wife. So he's somebody who understands about withholding. He advises this frugality. He says, please, let's keep rich storehouses. And then the years of famine do come. And of course, they're well prepared for this famine. And in fact, all of Egypt is transformed into a feudal economy because of this brilliant Jewish Secretary of State who knows how to marshal everybody's resources. He enriches the Pharaoh immensely. He becomes absolutely indispensable. And ultimately, his brothers, there's famine back in Canaan. The father sends the brothers, you remember the story. And when they come to Egypt, the brothers don't recognize him. There's something so transformed about him. People in the Midrash say, well, he's grown up, or but who knows, like he's just become so Egyptian. But he knows right away who they are. And as you know, there's a whole set of machinations where ultimately he outs himself both to the Pharaoh that he's Jewish and that these are my brothers. And all's well that ends well, except that it doesn't quite end well. It ends well for this family who get to the land of Goshen, which is rich and fertile, and they get to be a fine, growing community until, and this is where the story ends, there arises a Pharaoh who is not Joseph, and the enslavement begins. So that's just the rough version of the Jewish story. You have two codes in the story, and both are evidence of a lie. Right? The first is evidence of his death, which was false, and the second is evidence of an attempted rape, which was also false. It was exactly the opposite. In the Quran, you know what? I'm going to pause it before that and just take you to your source sheets for a minute, because I want to direct your attention to a couple of texts that become very important in the Midrashic tradition. In the first, I just want to establish Joseph's beauty. Joseph's beauty is only mentioned at the point at which he is about to be seduced. Okay, he left all that he had, that is the Potiphar, in Joseph's hands because he was such a trusted servant, and with him there he paid attention to nothing save the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. Okay, Yafet Torah, Yafet Mared, and he is beautiful. He's both well built and handsome, and that's going to lead to the seduction. And the whole point of the seduction is we need an excuse to throw him in jail, right? So it drives the story forward. The seductress is not important. She has no name. She doesn't turn up again in the story. That's pretty much the end of her. She's just Potiphar's wife. His beauty is not important either. It's a sign of his heroism. It explains why she would have wanted to seduce him. Not a big deal. Though both of these things will become very important later in the story. And now I want to direct your attention to a throwaway line that also explains how the seduction happens, that becomes important in the Midrash. In English, it says that, one day it happened that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household were there inside, which explains what? How she could seduce him, because they were alone, right? She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me," and he left his garment in her hand and fled. Now, in the Hebrew, it says, there was no man. It's just a slightly different locution in the house. There was no man in the house. Earlier in the, this is text 5 on your source sheet. Earlier there is a moment where it says that Joseph, this is when Joseph goes out with his brothers to the fields. It says, this is text 5, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, being still a lad. Okay, so he is identified as 17 and still a lad, and you have the Hebrew of that, Shva Esrei Shana, V'hu Na'ar, in the next text. All right, so there is, I'm trying to decide what order to share this with you. Okay, there is a midrash that makes the point, and that which text is it? I want to skip ahead a little bit, maybe. What the midrash says about this. Yes, it is text 6. Good. So Joseph, being 17 years old, he was 17. This is the Genesis Rabbah. It's a medieval midrash. It says Joseph being 17 years old, he was 17, and you could say being still a lad. It means, however, that he behaved like a boy, penciling his eyes and curling his hair and lifting his heel. So what's bothering the rabbis? What's bothering the rabbis is Why would you say that if he's 17, he's still a boy? Remember, in that period of history, 17 would not be a boy. That would be a man. 13, you become a man. So why, they're asking, does the Bible call him a boy and not or a youth when they just told you he's already 17? Oh, it means he acted like a boy. And how do they define that? They define that as curling his hair and lifting his heel and what's the other one? Penciling his eyes, which will later be associated actually with Egyptianness. Think of the coal eyes of the Egyptian. Joseph is a certain kind of beauty. And what else do we already know about him? That he had this fancy coat, that he pranced around with it, and that his brother didn't like it. And we know that he penciled his eyes, combed his hair, coat. Oh, and then he was a dreamer. But he's a Lefkovitz. He's busy dreaming dreams, and later in the story he'll be interpreting dreams. And all of this will become important in the characterization of Joseph. I'm going to back up now and tell you a little bit about the Quran. In the Quranic version of the story, which is now remember we're like the 8th century now. We're 1,000 years later. So the Quran is composed roughly the same period of time as Rabbinic Midrash, and some of the stories are shared. But in the Quranic version, first of all, the Quran, I will tell you, I don't know how familiar you are with it as a book, it doesn't tolerate ambivalent or ambiguous heroes. All the prophets are good. They are pious. So Joseph is good. He is pious in the Hebrew Bible, but he has some qualities you might not love, like that boastfulness, you understand why his brothers disapprove of him. He's more victim than victimizer. He doesn't deserve to be murdered or thrown into a pit or sold into slavery, but he's not perfect. In the Quran, all the heroes are perfect, and no prophet is ever deceived, because a prophet, by definition, has the ears of Allah. So there is a kind of moral ambiguity in Hebrew Bible stories that are absent in the Quran. And that shows up in the way in which the Quran in Surah 12 tells the story. So in the Quran, when Joseph's brothers come to Jacob with the coat, it is bloody but not torn. Interesting, right? So Jacob looks at the coat and he says to himself, if it had been a wild animal, this coat would be torn. So I know my son is alive. I don't know where he is, because he temporarily loses his power of prophecy that way, but I know he's not dead. My sons are liars. When Potiphar's wife goes to seduce Joseph, she grabs his coat from behind and she tears it. And so the tear that's absent from the first coat is displaced and shows up on the second coat. So when Potiphar is told, Joseph, your servant tried to seduce me, he says, that coat is torn from behind. I don't believe that for 1 minute. You were chasing after him. So in both cases, the coat that was evidence of a lie the first time is evidence in the Quran of the truth. And the Quran adds a third coat to Joseph's wardrobe. At the end of the story, when Joseph tells his brothers to bring his father to Egypt, they say he'll never want to come. And Joseph gives the brothers his coat, and he says, give this to my father. And his father takes the coat, wipes his eyes with this third coat, sees that his son Joseph, his beloved son Joseph, is alive in Egypt, and agrees to go. So there are 3 coats here, all are evidence of the truth. The Quran also adds a story that is absent from the Hebrew Bible, and that is a story of blood oranges. So when Potiphar's wife is accused of seduction, there's a lot of gossip about her in the court. So the court women are gossiping, oh, Potiphar's wife, what a slut, she tried to seduce her servant. So Potiphar's wife invites the women of the court to come and to tea. And she gives them all blood oranges, specified blood oranges, and very sharp knives. And they're sitting down to tea, and they're ready to have their oranges, and they're about to, slice into their oranges. And Potiphar's wife very cleverly says, Joseph, come on out, I can use your help. And the servant Joseph steps out, and all of the women slice their fingers. Because, oh my God, he's that beautiful. And in, oh, that's all right, we'll worry about that slide. So he's that beautiful, and what it establishes is a kind of conspiracy among the women that we don't blame you. We understand that Joseph was so worth it. So what it says in the Quran is, and this is text 4, I'm taking you backwards and a little out of order here. And this is Quran Surah 12, it's verses 31. Some women in the city gossiped. The governor's wife is trying to seduce her servant. She's deeply in love with him. We see that she's gone astray. When she heard their gossip, she invited them, prepared for them a comfortable place, and so on and so forth. She then said to him, enter the room. When they saw him, they admired him, and they cut their hands. They said, glory be to God, this is not a man, this is an honorable angel. So the actual Arabic is more like, this is not a human being, this is an angel. But for the purposes of my talk, I like that he's called not a man, he's an angel. He's superhuman, he's supernatural. He has a kind of angelic beauty. In the Midrashic tradition, and now we can go further down our sheet, I told you all about codes, and here are the citations in the book of Genesis. In the Midrash, what does the Midrash say? They put the question in the mouth of a matron on the text 10. A matron asked Rabbi Yossi, is it possible that Joseph at 17 years of age, with all the hot blood of youth, could act thus? Thereupon he produced the book of Genesis and read the stories of Reuben and Judah, basically stories in which our heroes, our forefathers, are not so sexually innocent, and it's quite explicit. So the point is, look, the Bible is not shy. If Joseph had succumbed to the seduction, we would know about it. It would have been revealed in Scripture. So clearly, and Scripture did not suppress aught in the case of the older brothers in the house, how much more so in the case of Joseph. And then later on in this longer midrash, which is actually quite X-rated, I'm going to leave you to read it on your own. But what they say is that Joseph, on inspection, did not discover that he was not a man. That is, he went in to seduce Potiphar's wife. He was ready to do that, but if anyone can see where that citation is on the sheet, it is there. Joseph, here it is. The footnote to the Sachino explains that upon inspection, he did not find himself a man, and the footnote to the Sachino explains that actually he was impotent, that he just, wasn't quite a man. So in the Quranic version, in that tradition, Joseph is a superman, right? He's super chaste, and he's a superman. In the Jewish tradition, in the Midrashic tradition, he is not quite a man. He's prancing around in his coat. He's a dreamer. He's a dream interpreter, but he is not quite the man one imagined. So this is a favorite story in the history of art. And now I want to some of the interpretations of that scene of seduction in the Western tradition. And we can go through some of these a little bit quickly, but I would ask you to look for in these representations which Joseph is figured as either ambivalent or absolutely he's not going there. You know, we see here that he's, she seems, very often the excuses, she's supine, she's half dressed, she's very much a seductress. It's an opportunity for these painters to flagrantly display female sexuality. And Joseph is here, you know, she's more dressed, he's looking at her like, no, I'm not going to do this, but not unkindly. She's not so unkind. But the interpretations really vary in the representations of these two characters, whether she's being more aggressive or less aggressive, more dressed, less dressed. Oh, and let's advance a little bit. This is one of my favorites. It's the cover for my book in Scripture, where you see that he is quite beautiful in this very feminine way. The colors are vibrant. She's supplicating. He's both pulling her off, but not entirely resisting. And moving on, let's take it a little further. I just wanted to give you a sense of how much there is, and this is just a very small representation. This is a kind of yes, no one, I think. Here we have him, you know, really fending her off. Again, that very common posture of the two of them. Look at the angles. Next one I like a lot. No, that's not the one I like. Well, this is the back to Rembrandt. That's Rembrandt. Rembrandt is much more, we'll see it back to Rembrandt, a real flagrant display of ugly female sexuality, and Joseph is quite disgusted here. This is very much in keeping with the Midrashic tradition. She is represented, as the Midrash develops the character of Potiphar's wife, she never gets a name, as a vile. She's quite gross. She keeps his garment, she lets it grow old in her keeping, it's on your sheets, she smells it. But next one, this is the one I was saying I like. Here you get a very different sense of what might have been that story. She is young. She's the wife, perhaps the young wife of an old man. She's lovely, she's beautiful, he's terrified, you know. So, and we can flip through the rest of these a little bit. Here's Chagall. So it's a motif that continues, keep going. Here we have some more of these representations, more contemporary animations. And here we have, by contrast, the Islamic tradition. You don't have much Islamic art, obviously, because they don't believe in representation, but you do have Persian art. And the favorite story to represent is the one we don't have. The one of all the women of the court having their blood oranges, this one and the next one as well. Again, the women with the blood oranges, Joseph is being called in. No sexuality, no naked ladies, no ugliness. And in the Islamic tradition, she has a name. Her name is Zuleika. And she is very pious and very good. And how do you know? How come she must be pious and good? Because she loves Joseph. And Joseph is favored by Allah. And anybody who favors and loves the favorite of God must herself be good. So they write stories in which her husband is a eunuch, so it's not a betrayal in that way. And even in some traditions, in the Islamic tradition, Zuleika is renamed at the end to Asnat. And if you continue, I think we have a picture of, here are more pictures of Zuleika. She's lovely. She's not gross like in our tradition. She is lovely. We saw some pretty pictures of her in the Renaissance, beautiful paintings, one more. And here she is supplicating. She's often supplicating him, surrounded by the women who adore him. So all the women love him. And how does Joseph then end up in jail? Right? Because we need a way to get him into jail to advance the story. Because after all, it's the same story. I'm going to have to speak through my end here. So how he ends up in jail is Joseph says to Pharaoh, or to Potiphar, you know, these women are chasing me like nobody's business. I can't stand it. I'm going to eventually sin. I don't want to sin. You know, could you lock me up? I need some time alone. So he's locked up for his own, by his own volition. We're advancing the slides on this screen way too soon. He's locked up by his own volition in order to protect him from the aggressions of all these seductive women in Egypt. Every single one of them wants to get him in bed. So he's completely chaste. And here's our upshot of the story. If cultural heroes are the sites of our own psychological projections, who's the Jewish Joseph? The Jewish God. The Jewish Joseph is he's beautiful, but he's beautiful in a particular way. He's a dreamer. He's a luftmensch. He pencils his eyes and curls his hair, and he prances around. He is also he interprets dreams, which makes him the first. Yeah, he's Freud, right? He's Freud, and Freud's father's name was Jacob, by the way. Freud had a kind of identification with the figure of Joseph. Again, the smart guy, the one who has to be smart, who has to make himself indispensable. Some critics say that Joseph is a kind of idealized Jewish figure because he's Henry Kissinger, he's, Madeleine Albright, he's the guy close, it's Jared Kushner. He's close to power. That's where I'm going to end. So he is close to power, and therefore it's kind of, like Queen Esther or Moses. Moses also is close to the Pharaoh. They book on the Exodus, right? Or Esther too. She's told by Mordecai, don't say you're Jewish until you need to out yourself. They're closeted Jews, court Jews, close to power, who need to be there to save their people. So this is a kind of ideal image of Jewish masculinity, the Joseph figure. But I just want to suggest to you that it's also deeply ambivalent, because poor Joseph, had he not been a dream interpreter, had he not been that smart, had he not been that useful, he would have languished in jail. It's the Dreyfus story, right? He needs to be all these things, and he can only dream of being ordinary. It's an aspiration. Jewish men can't be ordinary. Be a doctor. It's about security and becoming who you need to be useful as a minority population. The Yusuf character, by contrast, and part of what makes Joseph's sexuality so ambiguous and ambivalent is because he's chaste. There's a kind of incompatibility in the Jewish imagination between this kind of piety and chastity, sitting in the yeshiva without girls around, that makes you sort of less than a man, ambivalently masculine. But in the Islamic tradition, Zuleika she becomes complicated. She's flat in our tradition. In the Joseph in the Islamic tradition, he's flat. He's just pure and pious. He's always good, and Zuleika is more complicated. She's the more interesting character, and they quite like her. So you have these actual oppositions. And where does it all end? So if we move on a little bit, what you get is, here's another one of Joseph marrying Zuleika. She's that good, she's that pious, keep going. You can pass the next two. I just want to show our conclusions. So in the Western culture, Joseph becomes the Joseph of the Technicolor Dreamcoat. There he is as Donny Osmond. Absolutely fabulous. One more. Here's another Joseph of the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Slide. There he is. Joseph is a fop. He is the absolutely ambivalent figure of masculinity, because masculinity and chastity are sort of incompatible. He's the Secretary of State, the beautiful guy, not so interested in girls. By contrast, Joseph is also still a very beloved figure in Islam. He shows up, I learned this from one of my students who's Iranian. He shows up on Shia TV as in a serial where my student said that when he was a student back at home, this was a part of a TV series, long series. What do we call those mini series? Of the life of Joseph. This was the actor who played Joseph. He was not a dreamer. He was totally a dreamboat. Here he is early in his career, and here he is later in his career. He stays absolutely magnificent. And in this tradition, his chastity is a sign of his masculinity. It means that he has so much control over his own libido that he is able to be master of it himself in order to be pious. And that's what piety is, a kind of mastery over strong masculinity. And I'm going to end by saying that the consequences of this in Western culture are not so happy. So you have in the early 20th century, Otto Weiniger, who writes this book, Sex and Character. He was an early psychoanalyst, and he was deeply anti-Semitic, which also means self-hating in this case. He says the congruity between Jews and women, because the Jewish men are kinds of women, reveals itself. He's saying that Jewish men are more like women than like men, reveals itself in the extreme adaptability of the Jews. In fact, the mode in which, like women, because they are nothing, they can become everything. So their quality is the quality of a chameleon. That is an article in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine by John Boystery, who writes Jewish male menstruation in 17th century Spain. And it was widely believed in the 17th century throughout Europe that Jewish men actually menstruated, because Jews were associated with blood in all kinds of ways. So Jewish men, again, as I said, are not actually men, they were sort of half men. And then, where's I meant to put this in, but I didn't, perhaps just as well. On September 26th, 2017, that was last month, right? A month and a half ago, the Jewish Board, you know the Jewish Board, there was an article by Batya Sargon, who writes a blog post, the title of which, the headline of which is, "The Real Reason So Many Jews Can't Stand Jared Kushner." She invokes the story of Dreyfus, and then she says, Jared has Jewish stereotypes that have haunted us for centuries. Disloyal double agent, check. Shylockian insistence on payment of debt, check. Controls the message in the media, check. Foments political revolution, check. And here's the one that interests me. Effeminate and chameleonic, check. So again, the idea that Jewish men, in the worst stereotypes of Jewish men, are chameleons and effeminate, that this adheres to the figure of, again, the Jewish man close to power, which then ends up being associated with kind of effeminacy and lack of, the qualities that are true of real heroes, real men, which align more with the Islamic representation. So what I want to say is that none of this is true, right? This is the way in which we construct ideas of masculinity and femininity. The intersection of ethnicity and gender, beauty and ugliness is a kaleidoscope. There is no truth here. There is only the evolution of stereotypes that tell us about how we are situated in culture, how we situate ourselves, our own projected anxieties, but that the consequences are sort of, the stakes are high. These are stories with life and death consequences. I would say most of the stories we tell about ourselves when we read them often enough do have consequences in the world for how we're treated, how we treat others, how we think about ourselves, and then having more time, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A, I think it also has consequences for the way in which we imagine men treat women and women treat men in different cultures. So you have a stereotype that Jewish men don't beat their wives. So the community, because they're not really men in that way, they're not aggressive, they're not, right? So the consequence that domestic violence in the Jewish community is more underreported than in any other community. And the flip side of that, this representation of Islam gives a false, I think, sense as well in Western culture that Islamic men are somehow oppressive. That, the myth of the veil, that there is a kind of aggressiveness and brutishness in this other kind of masculinity that's just as untrue as the way in which we represent Jewish masculinity. And I'll stop there. So thank you.
So we are going to take questions, and in the interest of hearing your questions, I have a microphone, so just